Alright everyone, it's time to talk about reparations and giving a few reasons why it's a terrible idea. And first and foremost though, as with I think every other political creator I've checked, I checked several dozen people's stats on Social Blade last night. People from the left, people from the right, people who are milquetoast centrists, even some people from the missing link media sort of fronts. Everyone is having problems right now where our channels aren't getting as much a flow of audience, therefore they're not growing as much. I'm basically non-searchable. I'm a non-entity on YouTube at this point for search purposes, which means finding a new audience relies entirely upon your action, other than promulgating my channel elsewhere on platforms where people obviously already know I exist. So there will be 4 links in a pinned comment if you're watching on YouTube to other video hosting sites. At this point, I'm beginning to migrate more content away from YouTube just out of self-preservation. It's not because I hate the site, it's not because I have a stick up my ass, it's not because, well, I'm sitting there whining and saying, well, my material got stale, I don't understand why I'm not growing. It's happening to literally everybody, so we're sort of all in the same sinking boat at the moment. So you should join me on one or more of those platforms. Pretty soon half of my content will only be on alternative sites anyway. I figured this, though. There are several arguments against reparations. That reparations is the idea of giving, depending on who you ask, they used to use the term minorities, but now they don't say that anymore because they don't want to include East Asians especially. The left has gone completely fucking bonkers. Now they use the historically persecuted or historically marginalized people moniker. It's also funny because I remember, like if you were to use the term colored people, it would be considered at least mildly offensive. But if you say people of color, it's considered politically correct. I'm failing to see how the two terms are demonstrably different, but they are. One will get you banned on some sites, and the other one is considered perfectly acceptable, despite the fact that it's basically the same slogan. There are several arguments against it, and some of them are made more commonly than others. The biggest default argument against reparations, right, and it's normally made by people who are, in the U.S. context, who are white, is that, well, you know, my ancestors never owned slaves, or, well, I don't, and what they did is no business of mine. That is true. I do agree with that. For instance, I would use the former argument because my ancestors were in Vermont to begin with before it even was admitted as a state. Vermont outlawed slavery from day one. As far as I know, nobody in my lineage going back, at least as long as they've been in the North American continent since the 1600s, ever owned a slave. Now, if they had, it wouldn't piss me off. The same as if they had some great triumph during their life. While that's kind of cool, it's like, oh, well, Warwick invented whatever, something. They invented the widget or something. That's fine, but it doesn't really mean anything to me because I didn't do it. It's not my particular personal accomplishment. It's theirs, and they're dead. Died hundreds of years ago. Now, my family lineage is mostly a lot of carpentry, masonry, and simple clerks and farmers. It's a humble lineage for the most part, unless you get to the point where you're back in England, and then you have some lesser nobles and shit like that, but it's been a while. It's been a number of centuries. Those mummies are definitely, they're just yellow bones at this point. In their hallowed halls. There's not a whole lot going on in the Warwick lineage, at least in my direct lineage, for several centuries. That being said, neither the things that they did that were bad or good really mean that much to me. I celebrate my lineage, the overall idea of the ancestry, but I'm not responsible for their good or bad traits. And of course I can't really judge them, because back then, like back in the 1700s, fucking everyone was enslaving everyone else. A lot of people act like slavery was sort of a mono system in the United States. No, most of the African slave trade went to the Caribbean and Brazil, number one. Oftentimes it involved the explicit use of force by one tribe against another in Africa for profitable purposes. And there was at the same time an enormous amount of slavery in Asia and certain parts of Europe as well. It was not an uncommon practice. That would be a different moral argument, though, but my biggest beef with reparations would be this, and it boils down to simple pragmatism. It has nothing to do with ethics, it has nothing to do with history. What genetic or arbitrary ethnic system would you use to determine who gets it? For instance, in the case of the United States, we'll examine. Let's look at the case of slavery in the sense of the United States. So, cotton fields and corn and stuff like that, down south of the Mason-Dixon line largely, plantation owners using slaves for agriculture. It wasn't really a thing in the North because you had industry. You didn't have the same kind of plantation system. Arguably, slavery holding back aspects of the South's economy, by the way, because, after a while it just stopped making sense anyway. And a lot of Southerners believed that as well, and were against the terrible institution itself also. It wasn't just Northerners hated it. Southerners wanted slaves, and so they fought a civil war. That's ahistorical. That's not really what happened. Here's the problem. Let's say, for example, number one, if you're basing it off race. Well, what about if somebody comes from Ghana last generation, no slavery, they came after segregation, they have a kid, the kid's black, do they get reparations? Are you basing it on the color of their skin? If you say no, if you're saying, well, no, it's about people whose ancestors can be directly traced to slavery, that's going to be a problem. You would literally be creating separate subclads of individuals who happen to be black. That would be your first problem. The second problem would be, what about the proportion of ancestry? For instance, if you're 50% black, one of your lineages, your mom, your dad, whatever, you can trace it back and they were all slaves. The other side of the lineage, they came from Europe a couple generations ago. Well, do you give them 50% as much reparations? Do you give them no reparations? Or do you just say fuck it and give them full reparations because there's are you going to have a one-drop rule for reparations? You'd get into some of the weird, like maybe Spanish or Brazilian style racial classification systems even attempting such a feat. Another problem is, as people suggest, the fact that there's no current person in the United States who owns slaves, at least legally. Unless you count the prison system, Uncle Sam itself. They got hundreds of thousands of slaves. Beyond that, though, as far as legal doctrinal slavery, it doesn't exist anymore. It was abolished a century and a half ago. How would you justify, technically speaking, even if it's through taxes or inflation or something, taking a marginal chunk of wealth from certain groups of Americans based on what happened in the past and giving it to another group? Would you take, for example, let's say you base it on taxes. Would you have to adjust and give a little bit of money to people who arrived after slavery had been abolished? What about Jim Crow? What about people who came afterwards? They don't have any slave relatives, but maybe they're first generation immigrants in the early 20th century. They did exist under segregation. By the way, even in the North where segregation wasn't a thing, there was still systemic discrimination. And by the way, even the most diehard ethno-nat is never going to argue against the fact that that existed. I would hope. It was definitely there. That being said, is there going to be reparations for that? The final thing I would say against the idea of reparations would be that it won't solve anything. Number one, it'll drive a wedge between people more, but number two, it won't actually address the fundamental problem. It wouldn't create any form of equity or whatever buzz term the left is using today. It wouldn't even out the wealth. It would be a one-time handout that wouldn't be considered enough by the people who are really pushing for it. They exist solely to push such things. If you signed a $10,000 check to every black American, they would say, well, no, our worth is really a lot higher than that. We want reparations 2.0. We've seen this before. People get a stimulus, they want another stimulus. Now, it's a more mild version of the same basic idea. If you accede to people, typically they will try to push the envelope further. If you give an inch, people tend to take 5 inches. It's just sort of the way that they work. That's about all. Peace out.